Devin Graves coming to you once again from Studio D, this time with part 4 of my epic home recording series, Old School Production for the Modern Age. And today we're going to talk about audio interfaces and what is the best audio interface for your home studio. The audio interface is basically the central hub for your whole home recording system. This takes your microphone inputs or your line level instrument inputs, converts them from analog to digital, and sends them into the computer where they reside for the rest of their days. This is done either through USB or through a Thunderbolt connection, USB-C. And this is the most kind of bare bones system out there. 2 mic preamps, 2 inputs, 2 outputs for your speakers, a headphone output, and monitor level and speaker level, microphone level, phantom power, that's for powering condenser microphones, and a couple other bells and whistles on here that's really not important to get into. When I started, most of the audio interfaces didn't actually have mic preamps built in. This was my first interface. It's a Motu 2408 Mark II, and it just had line inputs, 8 balanced line ins, 8 balanced line outs. It had 24 ADAT ins and outs, plus 24 Tascam type ins and outs, which is a protocol you don't see much anymore. And then it had this was a FireWire unit. The USB wasn't fast enough at the time. It was USB 1, so FireWire on a Mac was required for this. And you could actually daisy chain these things together so you could have a formidable amount of I/O in your system. I used this with Logic back when it was eMagic Logic on a Mac G4 400 for the first 2 Dead Soul Tribe albums. And I even had a second one of these so that I would have enough I/O to expand to use more than 8 inputs on my drums. And that is actually similar to the I/O I have for my Pro Tools rig. It's just, I have this 196 I/O, DigiDesign 196, and a Lynx Aurora 16, which is just line ins and line outs. And that is typical of the higher end analog to digital converters you'll have, where you spend maybe 3 or 4 times for the amount of I/O for a converter like that than you would for a unit like this that even has mic preamps built in. Having said that, nowadays the DA/AD quality is not an issue. The conversion quality is not an issue anymore. Even the most affordable Focusrite's Scarlett series, excellent conversion, and the mic preamps are super clean, and you can just put it out of your mind if the quality is good enough. Anything out there is going to be good enough. I know what it's like to have something that's not good enough. I have this Mackie 8 bus, a 32.8 bus I used on a couple of the videos, the one just preceding this, in fact. And that was my second 8-bus mixer. The first one I bought just a few years earlier. It was a Tascam M2524. Perfectly professional looking mixer, all the facilities, all the bells and whistles, cost about the same as the Mackie, but it wasn't good enough. It had the kind of mic preamps that are probably why this, well, what's now a myth, why this myth even exists. Those preamps were noisy, they had thermal spikes, and they just generally sounded like shit. They had very low headroom, very narrow bandwidth. They sounded bad, and I was wondering why my recording sounded so bad. And when the Mackie 8 bus came out, also did the next generation of Tascams. I think they were the 2600s, and There was a Topaz mixer. There was a Soundcraft Ghost. Soundtrack's Topaz, by the way. And all these generations of 8-bus mixers, affordable 8-bus mixers, came out in about 1993. And those had super clean mic preamps. They were usable. They were good enough. And ever since then, anything that's come out more or less has been good enough. Okay, maybe some early Digidesign M audio interfaces didn't have that good of preamps. Arguably, that was still this turning point. But now it's 20 years later, and even the most affordable, being the Focusrite's, absolute excellent mic preamps, totally clean, very pristine AD conversion, DA conversion. So anything on the market is going to be good enough, definitely. So there are some more important questions you can ask yourself. Really practical questions. The first question being, how many ins do you need? How many mics do you plan on recording simultaneously? Are you just a singer-songwriter at home playing by yourself, recording yourself? Maybe an acoustic guitar, maybe an electric guitar. Maybe you're doing virtual instruments, keyboards, programming drums. Well, if that's the case, you could look at a 2-channel interface. There are single-channel interfaces, but I would spend another $50 and get a 2-channel so that you can record in stereo. Have that acoustic guitar recorded with 2 mics, for example, or other strategies that I'll get into later in another chapter of this video. But I would say a minimum would be a 2-channel interface. But you have to ask yourself, is this going to be where you're going to stay? Are you going to plan to record a real drummer? Are you going to plan to expand? You might want to make room for that on your purchase. Now, you can get an 8-channel interface. It's very common. There's the Claret series, there's the Scarlett series, and many, many, many others that have 8 mic preamps on them. And if you're using that to record drums, you might find that you can get away with 8 microphones on a drum set, especially if it's a minimum drum set. But if you're playing metal, you're probably going to want more than 8. So in any case, whether you start with a 4-channel interface or you get one of the 8-channel rack mount ones, look for one that has ADAT inputs and ADAT outputs, but the ADAT inputs are going to allow you to take another rack of mic preamps, not another interface, just mic preamps that take the mic in, convert it to digital, and send it to ADAT out. That's going to be less expensive than another interface. Plus, it's going to make your system work more streamlined by having only one interface, but expanding it with the microphone inputs. And with this, a rack mount 8-channel Claret Scarlett interface with an 8-channel, say, Audient, or behind me I have Mackie Onyx 800R, very old, very good mic preamps. Comes to ADAT out, and you can plug that right into that ADAT in. That will give you 16 I/O. And imagine this, if you had a drum kit like mine back there, which has kick, snare, snare top, snare bottom, tom, 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 4 toms, hi-hat, ride, overhead, overhead, maybe a kick in and out, so maybe that's another kick drum mic, maybe. I don't do that most of the time. So we have 12, and then room, maybe stereo room mics, 14 microphones. So a 16 input rig isn't really overkill if you plan on recording real drums, especially if you're going to track maybe a guitarist and a bass player along at the same time. Then you have one channel for each DI or amp or what have you. So 16 is almost the bare minimum in the scenario I described. So keep that in mind. If you want to record real drums right off the bat, then get an 8-channel unit that has ADAT ins, Or you can go with something like the Audix ID44, which is a 4-channel unit, but it has 2 sets of 8-at ins, so you can expand this thing to 20 ins, 20 outs. I think it's more like 22 outs because of the main left and right out, but that's splitting hairs at this point. So know what you need, know how many inputs you're going to need, and plan for the future so that you don't have to replace your interface if you decide you want to upgrade. There are plenty of interfaces that have just a few inputs but have that ADAT expansion port, and that's something you might want to consider if you do plan to expand. Just as important is how many outputs. If you have more than one set of speakers, you might want another set of outputs. If you have outboard gear that you want to send through after the fact, reamp your guitar amps, or just reamp something through a Neve preamp or EQ or a compressor or whatever, you'll want additional outputs for that. So usually something that has 8 ins has 8 outs. Something that has 2 ins often has 2 outs. 4 ins often has 4 outs. That could be a good minimum, which gives you the 2 outputs for your speakers on a 4-in, 4-out unit. This is the Scarlett 4i4. Has 2 mic ins plus 2 line ins and then 4 line outs. So I could do 2 to my speakers, 2 outputs to my speakers, and 2 outputs to 2 different pieces of hardware that can go back into the line input. That would basically create a loop where it sends the signal out to be processed by the analog hardware, then goes back into the system. Do you need more than one set of headphone outs? Are you recording yourself, or are you going to be in the studio with another person? You might want to find a unit that has 2 headphone outs. That's a taller order, as most of the less expensive ones just have a single headphone out, but that's not unsurmountable. I would recommend in any case using some sort of monitor controller, the Mackie Big Knob, not the passive one, the active one. And that's going to give you several outputs that you can A, B, and C for different monitors. You'll have a couple different I think 2 different headphone outputs. You could send another set of outputs instead of to 3 sets of speakers. One of them can go to a headphone amplifier that has 8 headphone jacks on it. So if you're recording a band, you're going to have to keep that in mind, and that's a little outside of the audio interface scope, but it's something you should keep in mind because not every audio interface is going to accommodate all of these headphones, for example, or multiple sets of speakers without some sort of compromise. So a monitor controller could be a good investment for you for that scenario. Another really important feature for me is having balanced inserts on your channels, at least on some of the channels. What an insert does is it's kind of an in and out that comes between the microphone preamp of the interface and the analog to digital converter. For example, if I were just to use this Focusrite, my mic goes in, it converts it to digital, and it goes into the computer, and it's never seen again. There's a lot of times, almost every time, that I want to somehow affect that signal before I go in. The most common use is with compression. Now, in my case, I'm not using inserts on my Pro Tools rig because I have my mic preamps. It's, for example, my 1073 for my voice. Then there's an insert on that unit which has a 1176 patched in and an optical compressor patched in. I wouldn't need the insert. I could just go from the out of one unit to the in of the other, and so on, and then into the interface. But on my Audient interface, I have inserts right on the channels, and so I can plug this mic right into the input. And then on the inserts, I can put a compressor if I needed to use a compressor. And that is a really great way for you to have access to additional colors without going into different esoteric preamps and things like that. Having a compressor is a really, really great way of minimizing your dynamic range. So it's going to maximize your headroom, and it's going to get your sound that much closer to a finished mix. So check for inserts. The ID44 has balanced inserts on channels 1 and 2. And there are plenty of units there that have inserts as well. Check to see that they're balanced, especially if you're interfacing it with high-end gear, which uses a balanced signal. Some of them have unbalanced I/O, which works, but if you're working with a real 1176, for example, you need a balanced line. So make sure your interface has a balanced in and out, a balanced insert. Another thing you might want to consider: are you doing content creation? Are you doing video tutorials where you're going to be playing Pro Tools and speaking into a mic? I do videos like this from time to time. And one thing that you might not know is you need a feature called Loopback if you want the audio from your Pro Tools session to be fed into your ScreenFlow session to be recorded and mixed later. So a feature called Loopback. I won't get too into the details of Loopback. I noticed that Loopback tends to become more standard on interfaces of 4 channels or more. I think that it needs those extra 2 channels dedicated to Loopback. The ID44 Mark II has Loopback. The Mark I does not. The Focusrite 4i4 has Loopback. And I think the RMEs, most of them have Loopback. But definitely, if you're going to be doing content creation that's going to require the scenario I described, Loopback is going to be an important feature for you. Now, there is one more factor that's going to distinguish the quality level of your audio interface. Now, I told you that the mic preamps are all good enough, and of course I stand by that. They are. Some are better than others. For example, I noticed on the Focusrite, it sounds really, really good until you get to about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Then it starts getting a little noisy, which isn't really much of a problem if you're recording something that's loud, or if you're using a very sensitive mic like a condenser mic. You generally don't need to go up that high. But if you're using a mic like this one, this is the Shure SM7B, just out of shot, that has a very low output. So if you have to crank this thing up, it's gonna get noisy. I use a cloud lifter. It's actually called Launcher by Soyuz. Same sort of thing. It raises the level by tapping the phantom power, and you can get a lower volume throw and have a good signal. But just know that if you're using a dynamic mic and you need more gain, I find that this Focusrite, I think this is the 3rd generation, I'm not positive, just gets a little noisy, a little too close for comfort, whereas the Audient only gets noisy at the very last 10% of the throw. So the Audient has more gain, more clean gain. Now, these are mic preamps that are sort of on the same playing field, even though there are these minor differences. Maybe some people consider the Audient slightly colored, slightly pleasing, still very similar. But I talked about my Neve mic preamps. I have some 1073s. I have some APIs back there, Focusrite ISAs back there, all kinds of different really nice mic pre's back there. And those would go into the line inputs of any of these units and make the mic preamp kind of moot on the audio interface. But that's also a massive expense to buy an interface and to buy these outboard mic preamps. And maybe you're curious, how does a 1073 sound? Or at least how does a Neve sound? And there are some audio interfaces out there that pack a way heavier punch in the mic preamp section. There's 2 of them that I can speak of at the moment. One of them is called the Neve 88M, and that has 2 Neve transformer balanced mic inputs. It's not a 1073, it's one of the more modern Neve mic preamps, but it sounds really good. And although, as I said, these mic preamps are fine, they're not going to be in your way, they're going to be clean as long as you don't have to turn that one up too much, they're going to get the job done. But if you were to compare it to a Neve mic preamp, the Neve is going to give more weight. it's not just transparent. It adds this word you hear all the time. It adds color. It adds some sonic weight. It gives it more size, more girth. And when you're adding track upon track upon track, it starts to become more and more and more apparent. And if you are this guy that or girl that is just using 2 mic preamps, doesn't plan on expanding, just plans on going with a 2-channel interface, but wants the highest quality possible, that Neve 88M, it's bus powered, so it's completely mobile, which is another thing you want to consider if you're considering mobility, where you just plug this thing into a laptop and you can go anywhere. You might consider sticking to a smaller 2-channel interface, because as they get up to 4 channels and more, with the exception of this 4i4, this is bus powered. So just this, a laptop and a couple of microphones, and I can go out into the wilderness and I can record as long as my battery is alive. My Audient ID44 requires power from the mains, so it has a voltage adapter that has to plug into the wall. So that one's not going out into the wilderness with me anytime soon. But that Neve 88M is also bus powered, and that's kind of miraculous to me that you can get transformer balanced mic inputs, mic preamps that require no additional power, just bus power. It also has balanced inserts, and it also has a single ADAT I/O. So you can expand that thing to a total of 10 channels. You can make that work for drums if you needed to. So that one, that costs about 1,600 euros, dollars, maybe a little less nowadays. But that is going to be something where you can kind of put your mind to rest about mic pre's, what a Neve sounds like, or what a Neve clone sounds like, or should I upgrade? You know, I would say it's worth it. I would definitely say it's worth having these good mic pre's. And if a 2-channel interface is going to do it for you, that one ticks all the boxes with expandability and with balanced inserts. Now, there's one more. I just came across this. It's from SSL. Now, they have their lower tier line of interfaces, which actually I would recommend quite highly. SSL stuff is really great. But they have this line, this called Pure Drive. They have the Pure Drive Octo and the Pure Drive Quad. The Octo has 8 SSL mic preamps that you can drive. It's like a gain and a trim, so you can drive it harder and turn the volume down, the trim down, so you're not clipping. That's something you can't do on the Neve by itself. There's just a single knob, just like on the Focusrite or most other audio interfaces, just one single knob that drives the unit. So when you have a gain and a trim, you can pull back the trim and crank the gain and get more of this distortion. There's a way around that with the Neve. If you have those inserts, you can put a compressor there and turn the gain down, or the output down from the compressor and turn the gain up on the mic preamp, and you'll get the same effect. You can drive that transformer. But with the SSL, you can do it without anything in the insert, although the SSL does have 2 sets of ADAT ins and outs. It also has 8 inserts on all 8 channels, balanced inserts. That's through those DB25 cables, so that's not these discrete line in, line outs like I have on the ID44, but it does have them. So you have the SSL Pure Drive Octo that has 8 SSL mic pre's, like I just described, plus the 16 ADAT ins and outs, plus the 8 inserts. That's about $2,000. That's pricey, but boy, oh boy, that is a really top floor interface. And it's going to make you feel satisfied with the mic preamps you have. You're not going to have any envy or any questions about whether what you have rocks the house or not. It's going to rock. There's this one difference between the quad version as opposed to the octo version, is the quad version also has a variable high pass filter where you can cut the lows and cut the rumble and stuff, which I noticed that the Octo version does not have. So the quad version costs about $1,000. So 2 quads for the same price as 1 Octo, giving you those variable high-pass filters might be something to think about. Having said that, it is more complicated if you're using 2 interfaces into your DAW. Not all DAWs can do that, especially PC DAWs. I think they can't do it. With the Mac, you have this thing called aggregate I/O, so you can use multiple interfaces, but I think that that's kind of setting yourself up for some more complications. If you have a single interface and then you just expand that with the ADAT IOs for more mic inputs, that's going to still be one single interface, and I think it's going to be more problem-free. And it's also going to work on the PC systems. And the final thing you might want to think about is whether or not you want additional DSP horsepower. There are starting to be more and more audio interfaces that have onboard DSP chips and even include plugins that run on these chips. The most notable one is the Apollo series from Universal Audio. And this was kind of a response to the TDM Pro Tool systems, where the TDM rigs, like mine, have these cards that have DSP power on them. And this allows you to run massive amounts of really good plugins without taxing your computer's resources whatsoever. Now, with the Universal Audio systems, the Apollo systems, they have DSP built in, and your signal hits that DSP before it gets into the computer. So you can actually record into the computer using EQ emulations, mic preamp emulations, compressor emulations, very similar to the way you could with hardware. Whether or not it's actually as good as the hardware is another question, probably a question you'll always ask yourself until you actually have the hardware. But the Pro Tools system that I have does not pass through the DSP before printing. So if I were recording on my HD system and I put a compressor on my vocal in a plugin form, it's not recording that plugin. And so I'm still getting the maximum peaks and all that stuff in my dynamic range. So that is alleviated with the Apollo system and with perhaps some other systems that are out there. And that is zero latency monitoring with those effects because, as I said, those effects are happening before it even gets into the computer. Before the signal gets into the computer, it's already being affected, and you can record with or without those effects, whether you monitor with effects or not. So that's a very cool thing, and it will give you a lot of flavors. And actually, I think it's a smart way to begin if you haven't had a lot of experience with hardware. Using the plugins of emulations might give you a taste for the hardware that you like. It certainly did for me. And that way, when you decide you're going to get your 1176 or your 1073 or your LA2A, you'll know why you're getting it because the plugins do what you want them to do. And then you can invest in the hardware and you will be certainly not disappointed in the hardware. So DSP, although it's not critical, especially in today's age of computers that, the CPU of most computers nowadays makes how many plugins you can use a non-issue, but the latency is an issue, and that's the advantage to having a DSP-based audio interface like the Apollo systems. And there are more out there. You can do some research. I can't cover all of the audio interfaces out there, but that Apollo system is a very tried and true type of DSP equipped audio interface. So that's about all I have on this subject. I hope I have made things clear. And if you have any questions, if you have any preferences, if you have any experiences regarding audio interfaces, regarding DSP-based systems, put them in the comments below. We can help each other out here. Maybe you can help somebody else. And if you have any questions, please ask. I will be happy to answer. I do read these questions as much as I can. Please like, please subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.